Okay. Chapter 23, Paleobiology and Macroevolution, a part to see. This is basically supplementary information, so I want to try to fill in some of the gaps. I feel like in this chapter we talked a lot about the fossil record and uh, macroevolutionary trends. And in this chapter, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to try to tie it together so you get a big picture of what the history of life on Earth is according to the fossil record. And then we're going to look at two examples of macroevolution in a little bit more detail. All right, so first up, these are slides I stole from my general biology class. When you look at the history of fossil layers and rocks that have animals and plants in them, you'll see that they make up an eon. So there's the Phanerozoic eon, which consists of all of the periods of life on Earth that we see fossils of some sort of relatively advanced animal life. We're not really concerned with the eon. We'd rather break it up into three eras. So you can see eons get broken up into eras, and eras get broken up into periods, and so on. And I've been talking about some of the periods. You don't have to know them, but you do need to know these three eras. So the first era is the Paleozoic era. And the Paleozoic era encompasses about 300 million years. So it begins here in the Cambrian 544 million years ago, and it continues to the mass extinction event at the end of the Permian about 250 million years ago. The Paleozoic is sometimes called the Age of Invertebrates because a lot of the fossils that we find from this era are invertebrates. Now, not exclusively. We find vertebrates, but the majority are invertebrates. Sometimes the Paleozoic is also called the Age of Fish because as far as vertebrates go, we find a lot of fish during this time as well. Now, we still find some amphibians and reptiles later on, but the invertebrates and the fish dominate the Paleozoic. The second era is the Mesozoic. The Mesozoic begins after the Permian extinction event and continues until the KT extinction event when the asteroid takes out the dinosaurs. So guess what the major animal that dominates the Mesozoic is? The major type of animal? It's the reptiles, which would include dinosaurs. So the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous are dominated by different types of reptiles. And then after the dinosaurs go extinct, we see the rise and the radiation of mammals, and so that encompasses the Cenozoic era. So the Cenozoic era began about 66 million years ago and continues to the present day. It's the era that we're still in, and again, the dominant animals are mammals. This is the same thing. I don't know why I included this actually. This is just showing Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. Again, the Paleozoic showing that it represents the deepest fossil layers that have advanced animal life, and the Cenozoic includes the most recent rock and fossil layers that include the most advanced and complex animal life like you and me. All right, so now what I want to do is work our way through the fossil record, beginning with the oldest. So on the left-hand slide, I stole these slides from somebody, I think Greg Davidson at Mississippi State, but I didn't give him credit here. Oh, I guess I just did. I mentioned his name. What we're going to do is we're going to move through. Again, we're going to focus on the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic eras, and we're going to begin at the beginning of the Paleozoic. So we're kind of skipping over the periods of Earth's history that the fossils mostly consist of bacteria and algae and, frankly, the kind of boring stuff. And we're going to begin at the beginning of the Paleozoic when the first animal life appears. Okay, well, just kidding. We're actually going to begin back here. So the oldest fossils of living organisms are bacteria, but it's not individual bacteria. It's hard to find an individual bacteria that's preserved as a fossil. And so what we find is stromatolites. So these things look like rocks, but this is not a rock. This is trillions and trillions of bacteria living in a huge colony. So we still find these stromatolites in places like Australia, in these shallow seas where the conditions are right. And basically what's going on is you've got all these different layers of bacteria and maybe some algae in there, and the point is they're all Some of them are maybe undergoing photosynthesis, and some of them are eating other bacteria, and so it's this complex ecosystem, and they kind of grow almost like they're their own organism. So these stromatolites can be found in the fossil records. They're some of the earliest representations of life. So these go back billions of years. And then later on, we get some hints at multicellular life. So these are algae, I believe. And then right before the Paleozoic begins, we get these weird critters that scientists don't even know if they're animals or plants or algae. They're just weird. So we start seeing some complex animal life. Prior to the Paleozoic, it's just really strange and fairly rare. So, oops, wrong way. So let's begin here in the Paleozoic. Right? And so these are some of the animals represented in the Cambrian. So these are drawings based off of fossils. Here's a trilobite, which I mentioned in the last video. But like this is a weird animal that's really small. It could fit in the palm of your hand, called hallucigenia. So you can see it's kind of like a worm, a tube worm with these spikes, and it's got these legs that are like extension tubes of its body wall. Really weird. We get this guy. This is Anomaloceras. So you can see it kind of superficially resembles a trilobite in that it's segmented. Is this Anomaloceras? I'm not exact. Don't quote me on that. And this thing, again, really weird. You can tell just by looking at it. So the animals that first show up, the oldest animals that show up in the fossil record, are weird, really strange, and they're all extinct. Wrong direction again, huh? So next is the animals represented in the Ordovician period. Again, we're still in the Paleozoic era. So here we start seeing some weird critters, but they're looking more recognizable. So this is a jawless fish. So we see some fish that lack jaws, and so they would suck up mud or food and maybe filter feed it. And these things lacked teeth, they lacked fins, and so they're fish for sure, they're vertebrates, but they're weird. We also see other weird critters, like this is a sea scorpion, and so we see these arthropods that are related to modern arthropods like crustaceans, but they're just weird and kind of bizarre at times. I keep going the wrong direction. Okay, the Silurian, we see more fish, like spiny sharks. This is a sea scorpion. You can see how big it is. This is a different species than we saw on the last slide. So really big arthropods. We start seeing more evidence of predation. So animals are getting better at eating each other, and so therefore you start seeing some defensive structures. You'll see more of that shortly. And meanwhile on land, we see the first land plants. This is Cooksonia. So this teeny little, I don't know, an inch. They're really small, but you can see it doesn't really have leaves or roots. It's a primitive plant, but this is one of the first plant species to move onto land. Then later in the Devonian, we see a diversification of fish. So we see these big bony jawed fish like placoderms. And so this fish, this is called Dunkleosteus. And this thing had a jaw. It didn't have true teeth. It just kind of had this sharpened jaw ridge. And you would not want to mess with this thing. This thing's the size of a school bus, so really big. And they would hunt their prey and probably dart after them and just take big bites out of them. So it kind of functioned like a shark. We see insects in the Devonian, and so but the insects are fairly primitive, so they display fairly ancestral characteristics. We see fishopods like Tiktaalik. So this is a fish, but it's a fish with a neck and a rib cage and wrists. So kind of a transitional species between fish and amphibians. Speaking of amphibians, we see the first amphibians show up in the Devonian. And so amphibians reproduce and live in water, but they're capable of coming onto land because the adults have lungs. So this is a story of pretty advanced aquatic organisms, but also fish that are transitioning to land, amphibians that have transitioned to a lifestyle where they're a hybrid between aquatic and terrestrial, and we're starting to see some insects. Then later in the Carboniferous, which is split into the Pennsylvanian and the Mississippian, we see more amphibians, we see more advanced plants, although they're still primitive plants. These are lycopods, and coelus vasculars, and we see some of the first reptiles showing up. Then in the Permian, we see even more advanced reptiles like Dimetrodon, this guy right here, and we see some reptiles that are starting to display some mammal-like characteristics. In other words, they're still reptiles and they lay eggs and they've got scaly skin, but they're starting to show some anatomical similarities to mammals. But no mammals have shown up yet. All right, and then the Mesozoic, or the Age of Reptiles, we see lots of different reptiles continue to diversify. So now some of them are running around on two legs. We start to see some of the earliest dinosaurs. We eventually will see feathered dinosaurs. We see flying reptiles. We see swimming reptiles. And we see some of the first mammals. In the Jurassic, a little bit later in the Mesozoic, we see greater diversification of the dinosaurs. So now you're starting to see dinosaurs like Stegosaurus that you would recognize. We still see some mammals. The mammals continue to be small and nocturnal and probably were eating insects. And we continue to see feathered dinosaurs, some of which are becoming more bird-like. By the time we get to the Cretaceous, dinosaurs are dominant. We've got T-Rexes and Allosaurus and all sorts of different dinosaurs represented. We see the first flowering plants, although they're fairly primitive. We see more mammals, but there's still minor players on the grand scheme of things, and we continue to see swimming and flying reptiles. After the asteroid impact wipes out the dinosaurs and ends the Mesozoic, we begin the Cenozoic, and in the Cenozoic we see diversification of flowering plants and their insect pollinators, and we see some pretty specialized flowering plants like cacti, for example, and grasses. We see some really weird animals, titanotheres. We see woolly mammoths and woolly rhinos. See giant wolves, and a lot of now extinct species of mammals that are the ancestors of living representatives. This is when we would see, early in the Cenozoic is when we'd see some of those small camels and small horses and small elephants that we talked about earlier. In the Cenozoic, we see that birds continue to diversify. So waterfowl initially, like ducks, and eventually more advanced birds like heron-like birds and raptors and so on. Later on in the Cenozoic, things get really cold. We have the ice ages, and so this is when you see a lot of your woolly or furry mammals like thick fur, woolly mammoths, also mastodons, saber-toothed cats, etc. And then at the end of the Cenozoic is when we start seeing plants and animals that have modern analogs. So we start seeing walruses and primates and flowering plants and grasses like wheat, and birds continue to diversify into lots of different forms. So that's kind of a really quick overview of the history of life. Again, this is just according to the fossils. Let's look at two examples of macroevolution. The first one is birds. So you've heard a lot of this before. We learned earlier that we learned earlier that feathers first appeared probably as a display device to communicate visually with other feathered dinosaurs. But that begs the question, where did the feathers come from? They just start growing feathers? Well, you're going to see over the next couple slides that feathers evolved and went through several steps. This is from a paper that's talking about the evolution of the feather. So reptiles, including dinosaurs, have scales on their skin, and it's thought that this scale over time started to stick out more, and then basically these scales became little hollow tubes, and this was the beginning of feathers, right? And these hollow tubes, let me go to the next slide. Oh, that looks complicated. Let's go to this one. These hollow tubes were just extensions of the scales, and then if you put some pigments in here, you can imagine how these scales might start giving the dinosaur the ability to have different colors and color patterns that they could use for display. And the next stage of feather evolution is these scales started to grow these filaments out of them, and so we get these types of feathers here represented as 2 and 3. So these would be analogous to down feathers. So I mentioned down feathers are used to keep a bird waterproof or warm. So chicks don't fly, but they're covered in down, and that helps keep them warm because birds are warm-blooded. And then down is also, you also have downy feathers that are covered in waterproof material. So ducks will have down. It helps keep them waterproof as they swim around on the water. Then these filaments, instead of being all separated, started to conjoin, and so we get the evolution of a basic feather. And so these feathers might not be used for flight, but they could be used for display. And then the last stage of feather evolution is the asymmetrical flight feather. So these feathers would provide lift when a bird is flapping its wings, and so we just see flight feathers show up later. And then this is going to allow birds to and feathered dinosaurs to take to the air. So that's how feathers evolved. I mentioned that some dinosaurs had feathers. In the original Jurassic Park movies, for example, you saw velociraptors that look like this. Velociraptors were bipedal, so they walked around on two legs. They've got these big claws for slashing their prey. And artists for a long time drew them as giant lizards, right? And that makes sense because dinosaurs are lizards, so shouldn't they have lizard-like skin? And we know that lots of dinosaurs did have lizard-like skin. But some fossils that have been coming out of China have shown that maybe velociraptors had feathers on them. So maybe they were fuzzy or furry. And again, these feathers aren't used for flight. I'm not saying that velociraptors could fly. They could not. But these feathers maybe help keep them warm or were used for display. Either way, it makes them look pretty freaky. So if we look at the evolution of the feathers compared to a phylogeny of the dinosaurs, I know that you don't know what most of these dinosaurs are. That's fine, but just know that stage one appears here. Stage one is that tube or that three-dimensional scale that I talked about, and so we see this on some of these early dinosaurs. So again, here all these dark areas, these are these little early primitive feathers. A little bit later, we get stage two. So these are these filamentous feathers that I talked about. You just have to trust folks, I guess, when you look at this photo. It looks like a rock, but apparently these are these downy feathers represented or preserved in this fossil. Stage three, we start getting a combination. We get these true feathers. Again, not flight feathers, but true feathers used for display, along with the barbed or branched feathers. And then a little bit later on, stage four, we get even more advanced feathers. I'll skip that. And then stage five, so at this point in the evolutionary tree, we get feathers that are asymmetrical and can provide lift. So we find this in Microraptor, which is a small, bird-sized dinosaur that's considered an ancestor of modern birds. All right, so here's some of that same data lined up, and you can see what a lot of these dinosaurs look like. So these dinosaurs would have had lizard skin. Stage one, they would have had these tubes. Stage two, they had these. Stage three, they had these, so combo. Stage four, they had these. Stage five, they had these. So evolution of feathers kind of parallels the evolution of the feathered dinosaurs. This is more of the same, but what's interesting here is you can see the outline of some of these dinosaurs. Again, walking around on two legs, and the forelimbs eventually became wings. But you can see the shape of the feathers changing over time. And in some cases, they even have multiple types of feathers, like we saw in stage three in the previous graphic. So again, just showing the evolution of feathers on dinosaurs over time, giving rise to modern birds. Let's look at another example of macroevolution. Let's look at whales. All right, so whales are in the order Cetacea, and so this would include toothed whales, odontocetes, and baleen whales, mysticetes. So you know what teeth are. So you can see the teeth on this dolphin. He's smiling at you. He's saying hello. And so these teeth are pretty cool for catching fish. This is a baleen whale, and this is a blue whale, and this is a humpback. And unfortunately, their mouths aren't open. But if their mouths were open, you could see that they don't have teeth. Instead, they have like these long fibers or baleen. And what they do is they don't catch fish. Instead, they take big gulps of water and then they use their tongue, I think it's their tongue, to push the water back out. So imagine when you take a gulp of water from the faucet, and then if you were to squirt the water out of your mouth through your teeth. That's the idea of how they feed. All right, why would they do that? They do that because their prey is super small. So they eat little phytoplankton or zooplankton, so little microscopic or really small critters that are found in the oceans in large numbers. And these guys just take big gulps of them and swallow, filter the water, and then they swallow the prey. And the baleen basically acts as big filters for them. All right, so how did these guys evolve? Where did order Cetacea come from? Oh, there's a dolphin. All right, well, yeah. So here's more external anatomy. So dolphins and whales have these different characteristics. So they've got forelimbs that are flippers. They don't have hind limbs. Their tail has a fluke on it, so this flattened portion they use like a paddle. They have a dorsal fin up here. Their body is streamlined and long. You can see it's smooth. They don't have any body hair. They have a really short neck, and they have a blowhole. So they have lungs, and they have to take gulps of air. So they do that by coming to the surface. They open their blowhole and take in big gulps of air, and then they hold their breath as they swim underwater. What's interesting is, here's a modern dolphin, and if you look in the fossil record, you can see ichthyosaurs and other swimming reptiles. And what's really interesting is they have a very similar shape. So this is a mammal, like all dolphins and whales, it's a mammal, and this is a reptile. And it's interesting because they also have a dorsal fin. Their limbs have been modified as paddles. They have a fluke at the end of their tail, and they have a fusiform, long, streamlined body. So this body type is an example of coevolution. So dolphins got this body type, and the swimming reptiles got this body type through convergent evolution. In other words, if you're going to be swimming around, you can't, you got to be streamlined. You need paddles or flippers to help propel you and guide you. You need a tail for propulsion. And so it's just interesting that dolphins and whales kind of ended up with the same body plan as they were shaped by their aquatic environment as reptiles that are separated from dolphins and whales by tens of millions of years. Okay, yeah. So again, speaking of tens of millions of years, swimming reptiles were in the late Mesozoic, whereas the dolphins and whales show up in the Cenozoic. All right, so a lot of this data I stole from this guy. This is my buddy Ryan. So he teaches biology at Calvin College, Calvin University, at Calvin, which is in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And he worked with Philip Gingrich, who's an expert on whale evolution. Here he is out in the desert of, I think he's in Morocco. And what's cool about this picture is this is the jawbone, lower jawbone of a whale. So a lot of the whale fossils I'm about to talk about are dug up in the sandy deserts of North Africa and the Middle East. Morocco, is it in Morocco? I don't remember where it was. So here's a picture of one of the sites in Egypt. So this is what it looks like today. But as we learned previously, the continents haven't always been where they are now. And more importantly, for our current example, climate has been different. And so sea levels are relatively low right now. And so the areas of Egypt, which is like a nice, hot, sandy desert now, used to be the bottom of a shallow sea. And this is where whales first evolved, in North Africa. Right? And these are examples of some of the whale fossils that we find. Dorniodon and Basilosaurus. Basilosaurus you can actually find in the southern US, but these are examples of primitive whales. I'll talk more about them in a minute. Here are some of the ancestors of whales. So as we move through the slide, we're advancing in evolutionary time. So the oldest is a whale called Pakicetus. Now what's weird is it has 4 legs and it doesn't have a fluke. So Pachycetus was probably a mammal that lived on the edge of the ocean, and it was semi-aquatic, much like a beaver or a otter or something like that. And so it would dive into the water and catch fish and whatever it could catch. And it was mostly terrestrial. It reproduced on land, it breathed air, but it's a whale because it has whale ears. So what all these whale fossils have in common is that they have a certain bone structure of their inner ear that allows them to hear underwater. So it turns out that hearing sounds on air, in order to do that, you need a particular shaped ear. But to hear sounds underwater, your ear needs to undergo some changes. So these guys all have ears that are adapted to hearing underwater, which is one way we are able to figure out that they're aquatic. Later, there's Rhodocetus. So you can see Rhodocetus is a little more streamlined than Pachycetus. Its head is a little bit stretched out, elongated, right? And this guy would be a much better swimmer. However, it has 4 limbs, so it doesn't have the paddles that you're going to see shortly. It still has paws. Maybe it had webbing between the toes, but regardless, it's got 4 legs. Ambulocetus is another one. I'll skip this one. Myocetus, so it looks similar to Rhodocetus. So again, kind of elongated, stretched out head, and it still has 4 limbs. All right, and then here are the different fossils. What's going on here? So this is Pachycetus, that first terrestrial whale. The aquatic whales, all right, the 4-legged aquatic whale like Rhodocetus. Then we get Dorudon, which is fully aquatic. It's got front legs, which are flippers, and then it's got the remnants of a pelvis and a little hind limb, but this would have been internal, so it doesn't have any external hind limbs, and it probably had a fluke on the end of its tail. And then that takes us to Balena, which is an ancestor of some of the baleen whales. And so modern whales have their front limbs as flippers. Some of them have a vestigial pelvis and hind limb. And you can see in the case of this guy, he doesn't have any teeth. And that's because he's got a bunch of baleen in here and he's filtering seawater. All right, here's a modern sperm whale. And again, he's got, I mentioned the whales all have a sigmoid process, which is their inner ear allows them to hear underwater. And it turns out that they all have that. So again, what links all the whales is having the same structure of their ear. And there's some other anatomical characteristics that link them, but that's the main one. So what we see is that generally, through the course of whale evolution, they become more and more aquatic. They begin terrestrial, that maybe forayed into the water, and then they were semi-aquatic, so they could move in the water and out, to becoming more and more aquatic, to eventually becoming exclusively aquatic. So this all happened over a period of about 12 million years. Let's skip that. Okay, let me just cycle through that. Well, I'll go back. So Pachycetus, that first whale, it's actually found, this is in modern India. So the fossils are found in modern India, but at the time, India wasn't connected to Asia, and so it lived here in this habitat off the coast, and again, would probably go into the water to swim and catch fish. Ambulocetids, which are another species, are a little bit more aquatic. They're found in the same area. So this is pretty interesting because Pachycetus is around, and then when is Ambulocetus? Do I have it on here? Sorry to jump through here, guys. Well, I don't have a date for it, but it comes a little bit later. And it's found in the same region. All right, and then as these guys continue to diversify, what would you expect them to do? You would expect them to spread out from here, and that's what happens. So then this guy, this whale ancestor, we find it in the same region, but we also find fossils from Northeast Africa and Egypt. So it's had to have become a good swimmer in order to make it from here to here. And then the next species, Protocetids, in the same area. And then the last species, Basilosaurus. Let me go back, sorry. Here, going back. This guy, Basilosaurus. So this is a fully aquatic whale, and I mentioned you can find it in southeastern U.S. So this thing is fully aquatic, and it's spread out. It's no longer linked to the coastlines of Africa and India, and you can now find it throughout Europe, South America, Antarctica, and North America. So by the time we get to the Basilosaurus species, again, fully aquatic, and it's able to swim around and move. It's moved all over the globe. Oops. All right, and so whale flippers, cetacean flippers, are homologous to the wings of a bird. All right, so in other words, a shark or a fish has a fin with a bone structure like this, but a penguin has a flipper on its wings have been modified as flippers, and it's got that one bone, two bones, little wrist bones, and finger bones. So its wing has been modified using that basic anatomical structure, and it's become a flipper. And dolphins, which are mammals, so they're more closely related to birds than they are to sharks, they have that one bone, two bones, wrist bones, and finger bones. So the flippers of a dolphin and the flippers of a penguin are homologous. I mentioned that that whales lost their hind leg over time, and you can see that here. So Ambulocetus, it's got hind legs. Basilosaurus, the one that went global, it's got this teeny little hind leg, kind of embarrassing, really. And then the modern sperm whale, it's got this little bone down here where its pelvis should be, but the pelvis isn't attached to the rest of the skeleton, and it doesn't have hind legs. So over time, the hind legs got reduced because they didn't need them. They were able to get along just fine with the tail for propulsion and then front flippers mostly for turning. However, some whales have, for whatever reason, they will grow these hind legs. So in other words, the genes are still there in some cases for the hind legs. So this is a whale that got pulled out of the ocean about a century ago, and you can see it's got these basically a femur growing out of the back of it. So the genes are still there for the legs to grow. What's interesting is if you look at this, it's not just a femur, but it has some of the same bone patterns that you would expect if this was a hind leg, right? So you can see that side by side. Femur, tibia, tarsus, metatarsal. So in other words, it displays a lot of characteristics with mammal legs. All right, here's a baleen whale. So again, we can see that it's got a pelvis and a femur and then a teeny tiny little tibia. All right, and here we can see the vestigial pelvises of several different whale species. So you can see they look different in different species, but they all have the remnants of a pelvis. Another interesting thing that happened through whale evolution is their nostrils moved up their skull. So the early whales had their nostril at the end of their skull. So that would be much like most mammals. So your dog or your cat or a deer or a cow, they've got a nostril at the end of their snout. And that makes a lot of sense, right? But as the whales became more aquatic, it was more advantageous for the nostril to be on top of their snout. That allowed them to just barely break the surface of the water and take a breath of air. So over the course of about 10 million years, the nostrils moved back on the skull, so that in the middle of the snout, and that pattern has continued so that modern whales, their nostrils are all the way back on top of their head. So the blowhole of a whale or dolphin is actually their nostrils. Right? They're able to open and close the flaps of their nostrils to keep the blowhole closed when they're underwater, and they open it when they take a breath of air. So again, the blowhole is basically their nostrils, and it's on top of their skull. Let's look at where these whales show up in the fossil record. Again, it's in the Cenozoic, and the earliest fossils are in the deepest layers. And then you can see, you don't need to know what these species are, but the trend that you see is, again, the nostrils moving back over time, and you see the appearance of baleen, and this is probably more complicated than we need to get into. There's also some other interesting lines of evidence about the evolution of whales. So, for example, um, this is the fetus of a dolphin, and it has little whiskers that it grows early on in development. And as it continues its development, those whiskers don't develop. But again, the genes and some of the cell lines express the whiskers. And this is important because whales are mammals, and all mammals have fur, right? And so the presence of these whiskers, which are basically feeling hairs, the presence of them in whales suggests that maybe they used to have them. These are the ankle bones of different species of mammals. So this is the ankle bone of a dog. And so these are the ankle bones of, this is Pachycetus, that first terrestrial whale. This is a pig, and this is a deer. So the ankle bones of these ancient whale ancestors closely resemble some modern mammals. So it's thought that they are whales are cousins to pigs and deer and hippopotami. If you look at a whale embryo, as it develops, sometimes they'll actually develop buds on the embryo, which is where normally the hind legs would develop. And so you can see the hind limb buds here. And then what happens is, as the embryo develops, the hind limbs disappear or are absorbed. This gives a nice overview of what I've been talking about. So again, starting with Pachycetus, you can see the transition from terrestrial to semi-aquatic with hind legs, to having a fluke tail and the loss of the hind legs, to having toothed whales, to having baleen whales. And again, all of these whales are thought to be cousins based on similarities in their anatomy and in their genes. They're thought to be cousins of the hippopotamus. So you can think of a hippopotamus as kind of like an early whale, right? It's a mammal, but it's semi-aquatic. It doesn't have flippers. It's got 4 legs, but it's shaped in a way that allows it to spend most of its time in water. And it's lost most of its body hair as well. So again, the hippopotamus, it's adapted to, pools of fresh water in Africa, and these whales would have been doing something similar early on. All right, I hope that was interesting. I like that stuff. That wraps up chapter 23, Paleobiology, Macroevolution. So hopefully by now you've got a better idea of the history of life on Earth according to the fossil record, and you've got 2 good examples of macroevolution that you could talk in more detail about come test time. See you next video. Like and subscribe. Later.